Hi, I'm Hobie1. I'm reading The Ghost at Skeleton Rock, Chapter 19, Skeleton Rock. Let's go! At least we have knives. That'll be some protection against the sharks, Joe said grimly. If any of them want a bite of me, they'll have to fight for it. Right! Frank pulled out two of the life jackets and handed one to Joe. They put them on. Then, arming themselves with their pocket knives, the two boys waited tensely. Pocket knives and sharks. By this time, the water in the boat was up to their knees. The boys had been so busy watching the water that they had not noticed a plane approaching the area. Hamilton again, I suppose, Frank said angrily as he looked up. Suddenly, Joe gave a happy shout. It's our plane! The boys hardly dared believe their eyes. Do you suppose Dad and Jack are aboard? Joe asked hopefully. And they've come to rescue us? Frank and Joe waved their arms frantically, yelling as loudly as they could. The plane circled and swooped in low. Jack Wayne was at the controls. Yippee! Shouted Joe. The pilot waved back to the boys reassuringly. Mr. Hardy was not in the plane. A moment later, the cabin door opened and an inflated life raft tumbled down toward the water. It landed with a splash several yards away from the boat, but Frank was overboard in a moment to swim to it. He climbed inside and picked up Joe. As soon as the boys were safely afloat, Jack dipped his wings, then began to circle the area. Too bad he couldn't haul us into the plane, Joe remarked. A half hour of anxious waiting followed. Sharks bobbed up repeatedly close to the raft. Finally, a government patrol boat appeared and Jack flew off as soon as the Hardys were helped to the deck of the rescue craft. Lucky or not, minus a few toes, declared the captain with grim humor. How'd you find us? Joe asked. Jack Wayne radioed an SOS, the captain replied. Better go below, fellows, and get some hot soup. We'll have you back at San Juan before you dry off. Jack was waiting to greet them at the dock. Man, am I glad to see you two, he exclaimed. Not half as glad as we were to see you, Joe quipped as they shook hands. Did you know it was Frank and me stranded on the water? No, I saw that the boat was not moving and decided to take a closer look. What happened? Frank described their visit to Calypso Island and his suspicions about Hamilton. Jack flushed with anger. The skunk! He cried out, but a moment later he said, I just had another thought. Maybe one of those natives who hates Hamilton put the hole in his boat. That's right, Joe agreed. It seems as if every time we suspect that man, there's a sound reason to excuse him. But Frank was not so charitable. I'm sure Hamilton was in that first plane, which wouldn't give us any help. Well, Jack, what's the news from Dad? Where is he now? Jack's face became grave. I'm worried about him, he replied. After we took off from here, I flew your father to Centro, Tropicale. He said that if he didn't show up at the airport by 12 o'clock last night, I should go get you boys and try to find him. Well, he didn't show up. The news sent a shock of alarm through the boys. Centro was the spot where they had tangled in the gunfight between the police and rebels. Could the gang have sought revenge on their father? We ought to fly to Tropicale as soon as possible, Joe urged. And we must get help to Chet, Frank reminded him. Let's stop at a doctor's on the way to the airport and talk to him. A taxi driver they consulted took them to the office of Dr. Roberto Cortez, just a few blocks from the waterfront. After hearing their story, the physician reassured the boys. From the symptoms you describe, I am sure that your friend will be no worse. If he had been given a harsh poison, he would have been in great pain last evening. But I'll write you a prescription which should ease the young man's difficulties. Greatly relieved, the boys thanked Dr. Cortez and hurried off to the nearest drugstore. While waiting for the prescription to be filled, they discussed what to do. We can fly to Calypso Island, give Chet the medicine, and make arrangements for the rented boat to be returned to its owner. Then all of us can go to Tropicale, Frank suggested. Good idea, Joe agreed. When they reached the airport, Jack Wayne refueled the Hardy plane for takeoff. But as he started to warm up the engine, it gave a sputter and died. The pilot could not restart it. Warily, Jack climbed out and went to work on the defective engine. Plugs aren't firing, he announced after a brief inspection. Impatient and worried, the Hardys stood by while Jack traced the trouble to a faulty magneto. Then came another long delay while he went off to hunt for a replacement. It was late afternoon before the ship was finally ready for takeoff. To the Hardys' relief, the engine purred smoothly as the plane soared off toward Calypso Island. "What about Hamilton?" Joe asked Frank. "You suppose he'll give us any trouble?" Frank shrugged. "No telling. I have a feeling that man is very slick." Both boys took brief turns at the controls, and Joe brought the plane down on Hamilton's airstrip for a perfect landing. The estate owner came out to greet them. "Welcome back," he smiled. "I see you found a faster method for the return trip." "We had to," Frank said curtly, introducing Jack. "Your boat sank." "What?" Hamilton appeared genuinely shocked when the boys told him about the hole in the speedboat's hull. "Sabotage!" he stormed. "Those confounded Carib Indians must have done it." For several minutes he ranted angrily against the natives. The sportsman seemed so genuinely upset that Joe glanced at Frank as if to say, "Maybe Hamilton is innocent after all." "How's Chet?" Frank asked, interrupting the sportsman. "We brought him some medicine." "I guess he won't need it," Hamilton replied with a cheery grin. In fact, he and Tony were feeling so much better they decided to go off and do a little spying on the Indians. "Why?" Frank asked. "Professional jealousy, I'd guess." Hamilton chuckled. "Your chubby friend figured the two of them might solve a mystery about the natives before you boys got back. Well, let's go up to the house and get some supper." The Hardys were puzzled and uncertain what to do. Could they trust the estate owner's story and fly on to Tropicale? But talking it over privately at the Villa, they decided it was too risky to leave until they knew for certain that their friends were safe. After a tasty supper, Frank asked, "Mr. Hamilton, don't you think Chet and Tony should be back by this time?" "Perhaps so, but I shouldn't worry about them." Frank and Joe could not accept Hamilton's suggestion. They had to find out where their friends were. Excusing themselves, they set out with Jack Wayne for the southern end of the island. They made a point of avoiding the open beach as they pushed their way through the palm groves and underbrush. It was dark now, but the rising moon shed enough light for them to see where they were going. Soon the boys sighted the glimmering windows of a cluster of native shacks. Natives were milling about outside, jabbering excitedly. "Something's up," Jack observed. "I wonder if Chet and Tony are being held prisoner." As the pilot started forward, Jack grabbed his arm to stop him. "Joe and I have had one set too with these Indians," he whispered. "Let's keep out of sight. We promised them we'd leave the island for good today." Staying in the shadows, the three circled the village. Suddenly Joe caught sight of Fernando. By hissing, he managed to attract the youth's attention. "Why have you come back?" Fernando exclaimed worriedly as he joined them. "You are in terrible danger here if my people find you." "We'll go quickly if you'll help us," Frank promised. "We only came back to find our two friends." "Your two friends?" The boy looked puzzled. Frank and Joe explained that their friends had come to call on the Indians. Fernando denied that he or his people had seen them. The Hardys had fresh cause for worry. Where were Chet and Tony? Was Hamilton making up the story of their whereabouts? Before leaving, Joe asked one more question. "Tell me, Fernando, why did your people get so angry when I asked about Skeleton Rock?" The young Carib shuddered. "It is a terrible place, amigo. It is at the other end of the island, but do not go there. Sometimes at night the ghost of an old cacique rises up to devour men's souls." The words were hardly out of Fernando's mouth when he turned pale with fright. "Look, look!" he quavered, pointing northward. "He is there now!" As the others turned, a fantastic sight met their eyes. Looming above the distant treetops was the huge figure of an ancient Carib chieftain. The specter glowed with a weird white radiance. "Jumping cacti!" gasped Jack Wayne. "So that's what Chet saw last night," added Joe. "No wonder he couldn't sleep." The whole village seethed with turmoil as the natives wailed and quaked in alarm. "What do you make of it?" Jack asked. "I believe that ghost is a plant by the gang to keep these natives in subjection," Frank replied. "Yes," Joe agreed. "And it might have been put into action right now to scare us away." "I feel sure," said Frank, "that Hamilton is involved in this. and in Chet and Tony's disappearance. Come on! I think we better radio a message for help from our plane to the authorities in Puerto Rico. As they reached the airstrip, the three crept toward the plane under cover of darkness. Joe warmed up the radio and started beaming a message to San Juan. Finally, the harbor police replied. Calling from Calypso Island, Joe spoke urgently into the mic. This is an emergency. 2 boys. Joe got no further. A gunshot cracked in the distance. Then 2 more rang out, as a horde of armed men rushed toward the airstrip from the Villa. Though still out of effective range, they were shooting wildly at the plane. 1 bullet pinged off a rock near the craft. Hamilton's leading them, yelled Frank, recognizing the man at the head of the gang. Get going, Jack. The pilot grimly went to work. The starter whined, but nothing else happened. Mixture control is jammed, he groaned. Jumping up, he dashed aft for the toolkit. Frank grabbed the controls and managed to free the mixture control before Jack returned. With a roar, the engine thundered into action. As the plane taxied down the strip, another volley of shots ripped the night air. A moment later, they were aloft and gaining altitude. Wow! Joe relaxed weakly in his seat and wiped the perspiration from his forehead. If the police heard the shooting, they ought to get there pronto. Nevertheless, he continued to send out a call for help. Soaring over the northern end of the island, Frank looked for the cacique's ghost. But the figure had disappeared. A moment later, Joe pointed down toward the beach. Look, he exclaimed. There's Skeleton Rock. Below, in the moonlight, a curious formation was visible in the coral reef. A portion of the rocky shoreline protruded above the water in the shape of a crude skeleton. Even the arms and legs were clearly defined. Weird, said Jack. Enough to make a fellow feel creepy. Now what do we do? What Beppo tells you to, amigos, came a sneering voice from the rear of the cabin. The Hardys and Jack whirled in dismay. A blond figure had just emerged from the luggage compartment, clutching a pistol. It was the youth who resembled Joe. Turn back and land on Calypso, he ordered. Oh, that's the end of chapter 19. So we have 1 more chapter to go. And click the button there to subscribe, please, if you'd like to see more of these shenanigans. Here's some more readings. Clicky, clicky. All right. Thanks for watching. Clicky, clicky, clicky. Clicky.